First of all, thank you everyone for coming to this talk today. It's a real thrill for me to be here at the PDC and to be talking to you all about the new evolution of the Windows 7 desktop. I was back in, I guess, 1993 when I attended my first PDC. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but this was long before I worked for Microsoft, and the focus of that PDC was on an operating system that was codenamed Chicago, and of course that would later go on to become Windows 95. And I specifically remember a session there in which a new desktop was being demoed, and there was this thing along the bottom called the sys tray. It wasn't yet called the taskbar. And there's a thing called a start menu. And it's just kind of a cool turn of events for me to now kind of be here 15 years later on stage and introducing or talking about integrating the new Windows 7 desktop to you guys. Well, my name is Rob Jarrett, and I'm a software design engineer on the Windows team at Microsoft. And specifically, I'm on the Core UX team. And we own things like the taskbar and the start menu, the actual desktop window, gadgets, and kind of related technologies. And a software design engineer, in case you didn't know, is somebody who writes code. And so I worked on a lot of the features that I'm going to be showing you here today, as far as APIs and a lot of the visuals and animation and things like that. And today's talk is technical in nature. We're going to be covering basically how you can use new APIs we have for the Windows 7 desktop to integrate your application with our new UI facilities. So we have a full agenda. I'm going to start out by talking about a new piece of UI we have on the taskbar called jump lists. These are basically a new way that users can use to launch your application. We'll move on to kind of take a step back and talk about application identity. And this really just referring to the concept of how things get grouped on the taskbar and how pieces are related to one another. We'll go on to discuss something that we call thumbnail toolbars. This is just really a way that your application can expose any common commands that your Windows might have on them. And another new feature of the new taskbar in Windows 7 is we allow your application to expose some peripheral status. And there's a couple ways in which that can be done. One is with using overlay icons that would actually appear over top of your taskbar button. And another one is using a progress bar control, or rather just a progress bar indicator on your taskbar button. If your application happens to be either a tab document interface or a multiple document interface application, we now allow the documents of your app to be exposed as actual switchers on the taskbar. And so I'll be discussing how you can go about doing that. There's some miscellaneous topics that are well worth covering as well. These are things that are either changing a little bit or evolving a little bit in Windows 7. So I'll talk about desk bands and some considerations for our window arranging features. That's what you saw at the keynote this morning, where you can kind of snap a window to the edge of the screen, as well as some new functionality for gadgets. And then lastly, I'll close out by talking about future platform support. WPF has some really awesome stuff in the works, as well as MFC, and so I'll be discussing what you can expect to see from those platforms. So let's start things off by talking about jump lists. And as you may have seen, first of all, just a show of hands, did many people manage to make it to the lunch session that Chaitanya Sareen gave for just introducing the Windows desktop? Okay, quite a decent number of folks. All right. Well, you can think of jump lists as really like a mini start menu for your application. They're just a new way that a user can use to launch your application. They can actually essentially formulate some intent before they're starting to use your app and go ahead and say, I want to do XYZ task, or I want to open ABC document. They are customizable by your application. We provide some things by default, but you're able to go ahead and override any of the settings that we have for you. And just a note about the name jump lists. Now, this is a fairly recent naming scheme that we came up with. And up until fairly recently, we have been calling them destination lists. Now, to that end, the API names, you'll see reference to the term destination list. And in fact, it's probably likely, unfortunately, that I may slip and use the term destination list, but I will try my best to use the term jump lists. So jump lists are actually composed of two main pieces. This is just an example I mocked up of what a very full jump list would look like. And jump lists are divided up into what we call destinations and tasks. Now, destinations are really just documents or perhaps URLs, a playlist, something like that, anything that your app would consume or create. A task is an actual action that your app could take. You can think of destinations as kind of being nouns or the things, and actions are the verbs. Now, items in the destination list all belong to a particular category. So the the jump list is really just a sequence of categories, each of them having items in them. So if we start at the bottom on the right-hand side of this diagram, we start with what we call the taskbar task category. And these are functions in which an end user can use to either launch a new instance of your app, they can pin and unpin it to the actual taskbar, and they can close any open windows that your app may have. Next up are what we call user tasks. This is a category which your application provides to us, as in the operating system, of any tasks that you deem useful to end users. Above that, we have custom categories. Now, these are categories of destinations that you, the application, provide. So, for example, if you were to think that history or some kind of form of categorizing your destinations makes sense for an end user in a particular way, you can just go ahead and expose that in the jump lists. Above that are what we call known categories. Now, this is a special type of category in which we provide the content for you. And there are two kinds of known categories. There are what we call recent destinations and frequent destinations. And both of these lists are maintained by us, the operating system, on your behalf. And you just indicate that you'd like them displayed in your jump list, and we will go ahead and do that for you. I'll talk a little bit about how the contents of that list are actually filled. And then finally, at the very top is the pinned category of destinations. This is completely controlled by the end user. They just go ahead and they choose to pin any destination that may appear in the jump list, and that will end up in that category. In terms of what comes for free, or what's just the default setting for a jump list, users will get taskbar tasks so that they'll automatically get the ability to relaunch another instance of the app, to be able to pin and unpin your application to the taskbar, and close any windows. They'll also get the recent destination known category, which will be populated thanks to an API that's been around for some time called sh-add to recent docs. This is an API that was originally intended for the recent items list that's off of the start menu. And that's a global list, but now what we can do is actually filter that list by application. So if your application supports sh-add to recent docs, so for example, if it uses the common file dialog, or a user launches a file type from the shell, like the Explorer, then this API will be automatically called on your application's behalf, and this list will auto-populate. And the pin category is for free as well. That's something that we manage. The end user actually chooses. A quick question? Or
.NET dialogues use the common file dialog for that?
The question is, do the .NET framework dialogues use the common file dialog? I believe the answer to that question is yes. Okay, so we talked about the defaults a little bit. We have the recent destination list as well as the taskbar tasks. But your application can actually either override or add additional functionality into the jump list. So I talked a little bit about the known categories for items. There's the recent known category, which is there by default. But maybe your application could make better use of having frequent destinations shown. Perhaps if you're a media player of some kind, or your application tends to just consume destinations rather than edit or create them, then frequent destinations could be more beneficial to you. If you deem that actually recent or frequent items may not be all that applicable to your application, or you could provide extra benefit in some way by having your own category of destinations. Internet Explorer is an example of this. They actually use their history that they populate their jump list with. Then you can go ahead and specify those destinations that you wish to be shown in the jump list. User tasks can also be specified by your application. And they're populated into the built-in tasks category that we have. There's only one tasks category, and one difference between regular tasks, or rather tasks and destinations, is that destinations are things that are pinnable by the end user, first of all. Tasks cannot be pinned, they're just always there. And secondly, destinations can be removed from the list by the end user, whereas tasks, again, are more static. They're always present. Quick question?
Will the task appear in Windows accelerators or not?
The question is, will tasks have accelerator keys for them?
Say yes. Windows accelerators, I mean.
Windows accelerators? Oh, you mean like the Windows key and then the number?
No. Windows
Oh.
accelerators like from IE8 but in Windows 7.
I'm not sure I follow the question.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, and actually I should probably say I'll take questions at the end. I do have a lot to cover here. But definitely if something's not quite clear or whatever, then by all means just interrupt me. Okay, so as far as what destinations and tasks actually are, they're either shell items or shell tasks. I'm sorry, shell links. And these are two constructs that have been around for quite a while in the Windows shell. A shell item is really just a pointer into the shell namespace. You can kind of think of it as being analogous to a file path. And a shell link is just a shortcut. That is an executable, a command line, has an icon and a description. And so the items in a jump list are either one of a shell item or a shell link. Okay, so let's switch over and see what some code looks like. I'd like to preface my demos with just a couple notes. Number one, our APIs are currently native only. This is just an extension in that the shell is written in native code. However, I do understand that most of you are managed developers. And so therefore I wrote some managed wrappers around our native APIs. The demos that I'll also be showing are going to be written from scratch. Just as a developer, I think hopefully that's more useful in terms of showing just an end-to-end kind of walkthrough of what exactly it takes to customize to integrate with the Windows 7 desktop. And hopefully that'll also show that the stuff is actually quite easy to do. So I'm going to switch over to my Windows 7 machine here, and I'm running Visual Studio 2008. Just regular install, nothing special in here. It is a version of Windows 7 that is later than the M3 build that you folks are getting. This is kind of a post-pre-beta, I guess you could think of it as. And it has the new user interface for the taskbar and start menu. So I'll start off by creating just a vanilla WPF application using just the standard new project dialog. And I'm going to first go ahead and just build this completely vanilla. And I'm going to run it to show you what you get in the taskbar with a vanilla application like this. So I hover over the taskbar button. I see the thumbnail for this blank window. And if I right-click to show the jump list for this, you'll see that I have something called vshost.exe in the name, as well as the ability to pin the program and close any windows. Well, what's this vshost.exe thing? The app should really be called WPF Application 7. Well, it turns out that by default, Visual Studio will use a host process in helping debug managed applications. This allows it to do a couple things, such as, I think, partial trust debugging. There's a little bit of performance gain there. But for the purposes of the demo, as well as I think in just general app, if you're developing specifically for customizing the jump list using VS, for the time being at least, I think it's helpful to just disable that hosting process, because it will affect how your application will behave. So if I go ahead and now rerun the application, and I bring up the jump list again, I see that, great, I have my WPF Application 7 item here. If I click it, I get another instance of it launched. If I pin it to the taskbar and then close the window, it will remain, and I can go ahead and launch it over again from the taskbar, unpin it, and then lastly close any instances of it. So that's just, plain old vanilla app. Well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add some tasks, some user tasks into its jump list. And the first thing I want to do is add in a code file that I've written, which is all the interop code for working with our native APIs. Now, this is a very thin wrapper. I purposely wanted to keep it very thin because I felt it was valuable to show how the native API worked, what was going on. And what you can actually, and again, I'll talk about future platform support, because a lot of this stuff will go a little higher level than this, but even as it is, it's actually not that complicated. So I'll just show you some of this code real quick, like just to kind of prove that there's nothing really deep or complex to it. It's just really a lot of kind of that yucky glue code when it comes to working with native APIs. And we want to actually start by, the purpose of the demo is to customize the jump list. We want to add some tasks to it, which leads to the question of, well, when do we actually customize this jump list? And the answer is, it depends on how you're customizing the jump list, or rather what the contents of the jump list are. In our case, we're just populating it with some user tasks. And user tasks should be just static things that never change. They should be set up once, and they don't ever need to change again. So in this case, it should be basically on first run of the application. Destinations and user tasks are on a per user basis. And so therefore, when the app is run for each user, it should, your application should actually customize the jump list at that time. So rather than write a bit of code, which will worry about if it's first run or the app or not, because I'm kind of doing this just live from scratch, I'll just kind of do a bit of, I guess, developer UI here and drop a button on the form of this WPF app that when we click it, we'll go ahead and actually do the jump list customization code. So, in order to customize a jump list, I need to create something called a destination list. And from the destination list object, I want to get a custom destination list interface reference. So, I will go ahead and first of all, include the namespace for my interop code. I'll declare a custom destination list interface and create an instance of it. By creating an instance of the destination list object and casting the return to a custom destination list interface. So we've just got now, essentially, we're telling the operating system, we're going to go ahead and we're going to customize our destination list. So let's take a look at some of the methods then that are on this interface. We see here we've got add user tasks, append category, append known category, and then some other items to do with beginning the list, committing the list, deleting the list. When you customize a destination list, it's an all or nothing thing. You essentially say, I'm going to start customizing the destination list. Here's how I want it laid out. And now I'm done customizing the destination list. So you can't just kind of go in and change only one item in one category. You basically just write the whole thing from top to bottom. And that just keeps things really easy. So we want to go ahead and customize the destination list. And so we'll use an API that's called beginList. Well, if we take a look at the arguments on that, there's actually two out parameters to this method. The first one is the maximum number of slots that are available for items in the destination and the jump list. So this is a count of all the items that can actually fit in the UI. And the contents of the jump list actually are dependent on the current screen resolution as well as the font size of the items that are shown in the list. And this is just a helpful number in case you're filling up your jump list with a number of destinations. You can kind of help smartly decide how many of each item that you want to be showing in various categories. Now, for our purposes, we actually don't really care what this value is too much. We're just going to throw in a few tasks into the jump list, and then that'll be that. So I'll still, though, go ahead and declare or still specify this out parameter. The second parameter that we'll get is actually a collection of destinations that the user has removed, explicitly removed from the jump list since the last time we customized it. So in other words, I mentioned before that a user could go to a jump list. Let's see if I have any items in here. A user can right-click on an item in a jump list, and they can choose Remove from this list. Well, if you're providing a custom category of destinations for your application, this is us letting you know that you should respect the user's wishes and go ahead and don't re-add that destination back into the destination list. I'm sorry, the jump list. Wow. So, again, for our purposes, we're just adding tasks only. And we're not customizing destinations, so we don't really need to worry about this parameter. So we will just go ahead and specify or just declare an out parameter for it, but we won't ever really do anything with it. So I'll add in the declaration for those two params. So now that we've indicated that we've begun to customize this list, we need to fill it up with something. Well, this method here called add user tasks is really the ticket. And add user tasks takes this thing called an iObject collection, which really, that's just a simple collection of actual objects. Now, what are the objects that go into the object collection? Earlier I mentioned that destinations and tasks are either shell items or shell links. So therefore, in this case, we'll create an object collection and we'll fill it up with some shell links that correspond to the actual user tasks. So we'll create an object collection instance. And we'll use an object that's called an enumerable object collection, a bit of a mouthful. And that's just an object that is now provided for you. This is just a collection class. And if we take a look at any methods on it, we see that we have add object. So here's where we actually add either a shell item or a shell link into this collection, which we can then pass to add user tasks in order to have our tasks populate our jump list. So how do we get a shell link? Well, I have a little helper method here called create user task. There's a couple of variants of it. One takes a display name and an actual command line argument string. And the other one also allows you to include an icon file to show. It's just an optional thing. You can show an icon before your user tasks if you wish. But for our purposes, we'll just use the simpler version. And we'll create a user task, and we'll call it task number 1, let's say. So this is just the readable text that an end user will see in the jump list. The second argument is just the command line argument that will get passed to the new instance of your application. And we'll just call that /task1. We'll add a couple of other shell links here. We'll call this one, oops. Let's say second task, and then we'll use /task2 for it. And then finally, we'll just do a third one, which will be, we'll just call it last task, and we'll pass /task3 to it. Okay, so I think we're good. So we've created this collection now of shell links, which correspond to our user tasks. Now we can take this collection and add it to our custom destination list. So we just pass in that object collection into the add user task method. Since we're now done customizing our destination list, we can call commit list. So if we go ahead and now build this, we would expect to see, if we right click, nothing is in the jump list yet because I still have to click the magic button here. But if I click the button and I right click, we now have a few tasks in the jump list. And so if I were to go ahead and select one of those, a new instance of my process will get executed with that actual command line argument specified. And just to really quickly show you that, I will open up the, I'll just switch over to using this mouse here. I'll just open up my application CS file and override on startup to say, oops, if I have any args, this keyboard has that different layout for the home and end and delete and all that. I will just show a message box for whatever args were passed. So I'll run my app, choose a destination, and then, or rather choose a task, and I have a new instance of my app running. So just to quickly kind of recap, I created a destination list object, and I got a custom destination list interface from it. I indicated I want to start customizing my app's destination list, or jump list, I'm sorry. I created a collection of links which correspond to the user tasks I wish to populate my jump list with. And then lastly, I added them into the custom destination list. So let's go back to the slides. So how then, like it's kind of neat to be able to customize our destination list, but how exactly do we know from the operating system where to put the jump list? How do we know how to hook up the windows that your application are creating to that button on the taskbar? Well, that introduces this notion of something that we call application identity. And there's kind of a common thread between the three main pieces of UI that are on the new taskbar. So those three pieces of UI are the shortcut to your application, or what we call the launcher. That's just the button, kind of akin to quick launch. The second piece is the window list of windows that your application currently has open. And then the third piece is the jump list to your application. So those three things are unified into a button. Well, what's the common thread that holds that stuff together? That's something that we call the application user model ID. It's a little bit of a mouthful, so we call it app ID for short. And the key phrase, though, in that name is user model. And when we talk about application identity, it's not really it's not an architectural notion, like something that would impact maybe security or how the application actually runs from a architectural standpoint, but rather it's just how your application is exposed to the end user, what the user model of the application is. So it's just simply a string that is associated with these pieces of your application, so the shortcut, the jump list, and the window list, And we use that to decide how stuff gets grouped on the taskbar. So each group, each icon that you see on the taskbar, and the items in the frequent list of the start menu, each have their own unique application ID. So just to try and illustrate this a little bit for you, we have the three main pieces of taskbar UI. They all share the same application ID. Well, there's a couple of additional pieces to that, things that aren't so obvious to an end user, which is the actual process instance of your application. A process can have associated with it an application ID. And I'll talk a little bit about how this can be helpful in a minute. And the second thing is any document type registration your app might have. So if your app handles a specific file type, like .foo or .txt or whatever the case may be, that registration information in the registry can have associated with it an application ID. And I'll discuss how that's useful as well. So where does an app ID come from? Well, the default case is it just comes from the process name. So if we given a window in the system, we can determine, hey, what process owns it? Okay, it's process XYZ. We know its name. For a shortcut, we can determine, hey, great, this shortcut launches process XYZ. And for a jump list, when the application goes to customize that jump list, well, we know that it's being customized from process XYZ, so we can populate the contents based on that information. When we're working with a known category, though, of items in a jump list, so this is known categories, again, are recent items or frequent items, things that we track on your application's behalf. When that sh add to recent docs call is made, then we need an application ID. And so that's how the document type registration actually comes into play. It helps us be able to place any destinations that are launched, or rather called with sh add to recent docs. It helps us place those in the correct list. Okay, so we compute app ID just automatically for you in the default case. And in many cases, that works great. But by using the process name, there are a few scenarios in which things could work perhaps a little better. For example, if your application has two or more different processes that both produce UI or maybe work with documents, well, they would by default be separated into two categories on the taskbar. So, or rather, if your code is perhaps hosted in a common executable, maybe you're a DLL or some kind of plugin, and you don't want any windows or UI that you produce to be just all grouped together. And so one example of this is if you're working in a common runtime environment where maybe you're a Microsoft Access application or something, and you are running in a process which is msaccess.exe. Well, you don't want all the Access apps on the system to be grouped together. Or what happens if your application is actually launched using multiple shortcuts that have different command line arguments, maybe to expose some different functionality of your application? You might want those things to actually be grouped together, but by default, they would be grouped separately. Well, in these different cases where our default model of computing the app ID doesn't work quite right, none of these cases are the end of the world, but just it doesn't work quite right in terms of what the end user may expect, well, then we recommend that you explicitly declare an application ID. So this is you providing us with a string that says, I am application XYZ. And so you can essentially just override this default computation of app ID determination. So something that we strongly recommend is whenever you're customizing your jump list, that you go ahead and explicitly provide an app ID to us. And I'm just going to go ahead and write a little bit of code here that will set this application's app ID explicitly. So I'll get a reference to the wrapper code from the application side of things. And I'm going to call a method which is a bit of a mouthful. It may actually qualify for one of the longest Win32 API names. Set current process explicit app user model ID. Actually, I think the longest is co-marshal interthread interface in stream, which I've actually used on a few occasions, sadly. But we won't talk about that too much. And what we pass to this guy is just a string. So we'll declare a static string that is we'll just call it app ID. And the convention that we suggest using is company name dot application name. So kind of similar to how a prog ID would work. And so we'll just call this test app 7. And in our long method name here, we'll pass it the app ID value. And something that we also recommend doing is right now I've set the app ID by making that call in the application on its startup. We've set the app ID context for the process. And if I were to make any calls into customizing the destination list, it will actually pick up the fact that I've explicitly provided this app ID because we've already essentially stamped our process with this custom app ID. But something that we recommend doing is whenever you're working with either jump lists or adding documents via sh add to recent docs or actually just those two cases, then we recommend that you specify the app ID explicitly. And you don't have to do this, but it's just good for performance, essentially. It makes us have to run less code in order to compute what your app ID is. Otherwise, we need to open your process, the process execution block, and read some memory there. And it's just more efficient to go ahead and specify your app ID whenever you can, is basically the rule of thumb. So I've gone ahead and done that to the application. If I rerun the app, you'll notice that the jump list is now empty. Well, that's because I've now stamped my process as having a brand new app ID. Before, it was using one that was based on my application name, my process name, WPF application 7. And in this instance, if I re-click the button and right-click to get its jump list, it gets repopulated under this new app ID name. OK. So getting back to the slides. Referencing that diagram I showed before, there's kind of a hierarchy of how we go about computing the app ID. And really all this is trying to show is, specifically if you look at the jump lists box on the lower left and the Windows box on the upper right, there's kind of a fallback path that we take in order to try and compute the app ID. So if you start making calls into the jump list API, we first check if you explicitly set the app ID on the jump list instance. And if you didn't, then we fall back to querying the process for its app ID. If the process didn't specify the app ID, we fall back to seeing if the shortcut is stamped with an app ID. And if the shortcut doesn't have an app ID, then we go ahead and do our default computation that's based on process name. If we have an hwind, same thing. We first ask the hwind to see if it is stamped with an explicit app ID. If not, fall back to the process, and then so on. OK. So let's move on to talk about thumbnail toolbars. Thumbnail toolbars are a way in which you can think of as being a remote control for windows of your application. They expose common commands that you think the end user could benefit from using. They are essentially a toolbar that can have up to 7 buttons in them. And they only appear on the taskbar thumbnail UI. Now, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what the difference between user tasks are and these thumbnail toolbar commands, because they can be just a little bit potentially confusing in terms of the differences. But hopefully this will clear it up. Thumbnail toolbar commands are really for Windows-specific commands, things that you'd find in the file menu of your app or on the toolbar of a window, whereas jump list user tasks are much more about entry points into your application. They're launching new instances of your application. Thumbnail toolbar commands are specific to the window that they're attached to, whereas jump list user tasks are completely application-wide in scope. So you can actually have multiple thumbnail toolbars for different windows of your application, and each one of those toolbars is going to operate only on that window it's attached to. You can have different sets of different sets of commands in thumbnail toolbars, whereas with jump list user tasks, you only get one set of tasks for an end user. They're static. They're basically read-only in nature. And then finally, with thumbnail toolbar commands, they can be dynamic. So you can do things like show and hide or enable and disable them, whereas, again, jump list user tasks are static in nature. So in terms of how you go about creating a thumbnail toolbar, there's a taskbar API, or rather some interfaces that have been around for a little while now, called iTaskbar List and iTaskbar List 2. Well, because thumbnail toolbars are taskbar specific in scope, contrasting this against jump lists, which are much more shell-wide in scope, we added the iTaskbar List 3 interface. And a thumbnail toolbar is simply an array of up to 7 thumb button structures. And the contents of a thumb button structure are really just an ID of the button, either an image list bitmap ID or an H icon. They can have a tooltip, and then a set of state flags for them for whether or not they're enabled or disabled, hidden, shown, etc. Now, just one note about the iTaskbar List 3 interface is we now post your message, post your window a new message, which essentially indicates it's OK to call methods on iTaskbar List 3. And the reason for this is just because of the asynchronous nature in which the taskbar gets notification of a window being created and your application getting notification of its windows being created. And what can happen is your application can say, oh, my window's just gotten created, so I want to go ahead and for example, create a thumbnail toolbar for my window. Well, the taskbar may not know that your application window exists yet because the kernel of Windows hasn't yet notified it. So the taskbar could actually just say, well, I don't really know what H-window you're talking about because I haven't been told that this guy exists. The way around that issue is just to wait until you receive the taskbar button created message before you call any taskbar list APIs. And I'll show you how to do that now in another demo app. So I'll flip back to my demo machine. And we're going to go ahead and add a thumbnail toolbar to this guy. Now, what I need to do is wait until I get this thumbnail button created, taskbar button created message. And in order to do that, I need to, why isn't that guy getting selected? Oh, I'm still running my app, that's why. I need to close them down. So I need to do a little bit of WPF Mojo, and I have a couple of code snippets that I've pre-written just to get around you having to watch me type in a lot of code that doesn't really have much to do with customizing the Windows 7 desktop. And what I'm doing is just adding some code in which will give us a wind proc to our WPF window. This is just an unfortunate side effect of the native nature, I guess you could say, of our APIs. Again, I'll talk more later about how we'll get around this kind of stuff going forward. We'll have it wrapped much better, but because I'm using just the bare bones native APIs, this is just a requirement that we need to do. I've essentially just created a win proc for this WPF window. And actually, one thing I do need to do is add that namespace in so we won't get any compilation errors. And in the win proc, I want to look for the WM taskbar button created message. This will enable us to go ahead and create the taskbar lists instance, which we will get an iTaskbar list 3 interface from. So I've already declared a variable, member variable, for the taskbar list 3 interface. And so I will now create the taskbar list object, retrieving the taskbar list 3 interface from it. So great. Now we can go ahead and create our thumbnail toolbar. I mentioned earlier that a thumbnail toolbar is just an array of these thumb button structures. And we'll just create a thumbnail toolbar with 2 buttons. And for the first one, we will, this mask variable, or this mask enumeration rather, just determines or will indicate what kinds of parameters we're specifying for the button. So we'll say that we have an icon and a tooltip for this button. And we always need to specify an ID for the button. This is just the ID that will later get passed back to us in case the user clicks on that button. The icon we'll use we'll assign it just using a helper method that I wrote just for the sake of us getting an H icon. I just wrote this quick and dirty little load system icon method that will get, say, I don't know, the question icon from, and then finally we will set the tooltip for this button to be button 1. So for the second button, we'll copy and paste like any good developer knows how to do. We'll change its ID and change its icon to be something like information, and we'll change its tooltip text to be button number 2. Okay, so we've got an array of a couple of thumb button structs. We've got our taskbar list 3 interface, and we can go ahead and call thumbbar add buttons. That's a method in which you're saying, hey, for this window, I would like it to have these thumb buttons for its thumbnail toolbar. So we pass it the hwind that our WinProc receives, how many buttons we have, and then the array of buttons. So if we go ahead and run this guy, when we hover over the icon of our app, we now have a thumbnail toolbar. So we've got 2 buttons here, and when I click them, though, nothing much happens. Well, we need to actually respond to the message that we get when the buttons are clicked. And that's just sent via a regular WM command, I'm sorry. And I just have that declared here in my helper stuff. And the high word of the W-param, this is like some fairly, definitely some Win32 era stuff happening here. If the high word is thumbnail button clicked, then we'll go ahead and show which ID, the ID of the button that was clicked. So we'll go ahead and run this now. We'll bring up our thumbnail toolbar, and we'll click, and hey, great, there's our message box. Okay, so thumbnail toolbars, pretty straightforward. Really, the only trickiness, this is a WPF app, and so I did have to do that little bit of mojo to get at the WinProc. I'll talk more about, though, WPF natively supporting this stuff in .NET 4, as well as, obviously, WinForms, I think, would be a little bit easier, too, because you have more built-in support for actually getting at the WinProc. Okay, we're going to move on to discuss overlay icons, which are, this is like getting into peripheral status of your application. Really, overlay icons are a way of just drawing an icon over top of your taskbar button. There's just one API that we have in taskbar list 3 that covers this. It's something called set overlay icon. You give it the window that you want to assign the overlay icon to, and you give it an H icon. For progress bars, very similar to status to overlay icons, in that we just allow you to show a progress bar for different windows in your application. Two methods on iTaskbar List 3 actually allow you to control what actually gets displayed. There's setting the state, which indicates whether or not you have any progress or not. If the progress is indeterminate in nature, that's like that animated whooshy thing that shows up, a technical term. And the actual value, if you have progress, just essentially what the numerator and denominator of the progress are. This is kind of analogous to how the common progress dialogues progress works. Now, if you happen to use the common progress dialog, this was something that was introduced in Vista, then you actually get taskbar progress for free. We hooked it up so that any calls made to the common progress dialog will also call into the taskbar List 3 API. So I'll just quickly show, going back to our demo app, how we can set an overlay icon as well as progress for our application here. And again, we'll do a little more developer UI by just dropping a few buttons on the form. Each button will set the overlay icon, a different overlay icon for our app. And when a button is clicked, we'll call set overlay icon with just some random icon that will say, oh, I don't know, that we could make it error, and another button could be basically this same code. That one will be, I don't know, doesn't matter, the warning, let's say. And then finally, we'll clear out the icon with the last one just by calling set overlay icon with what effectively amounts to null. So we'll compile that, run it, and if we click the first button, you can see down here at the bottom, we get an overlay icon, and then we also can clear it. So easy stuff. And one more for the progress is we'll just go ahead and drop a slider on our window. And I can show you that progress is really just as easy as setting an overlay icon. There's two values that we specify. One is the numerator, so we can use the events value, and the other one can be the slider's maximum value. And these guys are by default floating point, so I'll just cast to be unsigned ints. Now, in this case, I do need to set the progress state to indicate that we actually have some progress for this button. Otherwise, that API would no up. So I'll just say that we have normal progress. You can see that there's indeterminate, there's paused and error, which correspond to, instead of the default green bar, you can actually get a yellow or a red bar. Similar capabilities to the common progress control. So we'll just say that we have normal progress, and we'll rerun this guy. And as I move the slider, you can see that there's now progress in our window. Now, obviously, you wouldn't hook up a slider to your progress bar in your app. Maybe if you're connecting to a web service or something, it would be useful. This is just totally for demonstration purposes. All right. Back to the slides. So custom switchers are the ability for you to expose any documents that your application may have as switch targets in the taskbar. This is really just useful for tab document interface apps like web browsers or multiple document interface apps. And not only do we allow you to specify switch targets for those documents, you can specify custom thumbnails for what actually gets represented in the taskbar now. So the taskbar list API has a series of methods on it in which you can use to just indicate any custom switchers that you would like for your application. Essentially how it works is you create a proxy window for each document that you have in your application. These would be off-screen windows that wouldn't normally appear on the taskbar, so they would have like a tool window style on them. And you use this register tab API to tell the taskbar this window is going to be used as a proxy for a document of my application. And so you just register and unregister these guys as documents get created and destroyed. You can go ahead and set ordering of how these things will appear in the user interface, because in particularly a tab document interface case, the user can drag and drop tabs, for example, and you'll want the ordering of those tabs reflected in the taskbar user interface. And then when a user goes ahead and clicks on a document, activates it, makes it active, then you can let us know so that we know to highlight the right document in the taskbar UI. In terms of actually overriding the thumbnail preview, well, the thumbnailing is provided by something that we call the DWM. This is the desktop window manager, and it's the composition engine that gives us the glass effects, the core window compositioning, and what you can effectively do is override its presentation for a window and say, I'm going to provide the bitmap for this window. And so what you would do is formulate a bitmap and tell DWM you would like it used for the thumbnail. And the methods are fairly straightforward. You essentially just indicate to DWM that, hey, I would like to have an iconic thumbnail shown for my window. What that means is this is just a DWM thing that if you've ever come out of like standby or something and you hover over your taskbar buttons, you just see an icon in the thumbnail. You're going to say, I would like that type of view. But actually, when you go to show it, let me know and I will give you an HBitmap for it. So that DWM will effectively call you back and you can provide a bitmap for that window. And you do it for both not only the thumbnail, but also for the live preview, the full-size case, as the user is hovering over the thumbnails in the taskbar. So moving on just to some other miscellaneous topics here. Deskbands should now support rendering on glass. We want to keep the taskbar as clean looking as possible. We want to keep it in glass rendering. And so therefore, we will render all deskbands by default on glass. The effect that this may have is your deskband, if you have one, might not look as you intended it to in the non-glass case, because what rendering on glass means is you just support an alpha channel in any of your rendering commands. Quick Launch has gone away. The folder still remains for application compatibility purposes, but in terms of the actual deskband for Quick Launch, it's no longer there. So any installer application you may have, if it happens to ask the end user if it should add a Quick Launch icon on its behalf, then you should remove that user interface because it would otherwise be confusing to an end user. For some of the window arranging features, this is the snap feature when you drag a window to the top and it'll automatically maximize, or drag a window to the edge and it'll half maximize, as we call it. So you can do the side-by-side comparison. If your application has a custom move size loop, so if you're maybe doing some interesting non-client customization, or you really want to have a unique look to your application, well, some applications, when the user drags them, they actually track the mouse and manually move their window along with the cursor. Well, our window management or our window arranging features won't work if you do that. So we recommend that in the hit testing query that occurs via the WMNC hit test message, you return the HT caption value. That will indicate to the operating system that the user is dragging on the caption. And lastly, gadgets are actually launchable now via in a programmatic way. So a typical case for this is an installer would launch a gadget that it has installed already, and we think that can be a really helpful thing to complete an end-to-end scenario if your application happens to also have a companion gadget. All right, so future platform support. I've been demoing a lot of the native stuff here today. It's not the cleanest, as you can tell. I did purposely want to keep it that way in order to illustrate what exactly is happening and how the stuff works in a very explicit way. But there is much cooler stuff coming. In particular, WPF is getting native support for this stuff, so you'll be able to use just XAML. You may have caught some of this in, I think it was Scott Guthrie's keynote this morning, where you can just in a declarative fashion specify how you want the taskbar customized, or desktop in general customized for your application. That also allows some great features that WPF has, like data binding. You can go ahead and just bind values to some of our properties for our taskbar capabilities, and as well as use something like vector images for icons, which is obviously a really cool thing. MFC, something near and dear to my heart, is getting revamped for Visual Studio 2010. And they are going to be supporting most, if not all, of our new integration features. And last but not least, the Windows 7 Platform SDK is getting something called the Windows 7 Bridge. Now, these are some managed wrappers for the desktop integration APIs that I've been showing you here today. They're going to differ in that they'll be higher level, in the sense of they won't be as close to the metal as this. They'll actually do some nice things on your behalf. And so it'll just be a better experience all around. And you can expect to see those in the, I believe, in the beta platform SDK. That's going to be coming out early next year. Okay, so I'm running late on time here a little bit, but really quickly, I would like to show you just some prototype WPF support. This is some really neat stuff that our friends in the WPF team have been working on for a little while now. I'm going to create a brand new application. And instead of adding the interop code that I had previously been using, I'm going to go ahead and add a reference to this WPF assembly. And I'm going to write some XAML. So this is some code which will work in conjunction with WPF. And it will allow me to, in a declarative way, specify various properties of our integration, desktop integration capabilities. So I've added a namespace alias for this. I'll go ahead and create an instance of the taskbar item property. And I'll go ahead and set some properties on this instance. So if I take a look in the list of what's available to me here, there's a description, but also there's an overlay, which is just an image source. So if I want to set the icon for this window, I can just set that to any WPF image source, as well as any progress. And a thumb button collection is right here. So just all in a declarative fashion, I can go ahead and use that. So what I'll do is I'll set the progress state of this guy to be normal. Now also I should actually give it a name so I can access it via code behind. And I will also declare a a thumbnail toolbar instance, which I will create a number of thumb buttons for. This is kind of analogous to that thumb button struct I showed earlier, but in WPF I actually have eventing, like a click handler for when the thing actually gets clicked. I've got some various properties such as a description, which is the tooltip, some properties such as, do I want to dismiss the thumbnail UI when the user clicks it, or do I want it to remain the icon? And so what I will do is set the image source to be icon 2. Now actually, just backing up a little bit, I'll add some icons to this presentation, or to this project real quick. And add a few more buttons. And then build this guy. And if we hover over the button, you can see I now have a thumbnail toolbar just without writing any code. And I could go ahead and just hook up a, oops, I should exit this guy. I'll hook up an event handler real quick for the click method. New event handler, great. Same for these guys. And quickly edit some code just to actually set the overlay to be what the icon is for the sender. So for the actual thumbnail toolbar button that gets clicked, I'm going to set the overlay to be that in my app. So just with one line of code, I now actually get overlays being set in my app. Okay, so some really cool stuff that the WPF folks are doing. So just to wrap things up, a call to action here. Please integrate with the Windows 7 desktop. But in doing so, please just be mindful about how your application fits into our model. So this covers everything from just general unification. Do you need to potentially explicitly declare any app IDs? Can you benefit from customizing the jump list, or does the default setup of the jump list work just fine for you? Could you take advantage of any thumbnail toolbar functionality for common actions that any windows of your application may expose? Or benefit from peripheral status, such as overlay icons and progress bars? Or if you're a TDI or MDI app, could you benefit from exposing any of your documents? And I recommend that you check out what the new APIs look like. We're going to have a bunch of samples coming with the beta platform SDK. There's the WPF stuff that I just demoed. That's going to be available in .NET 4. Some related sessions for just general taskbar stuff. Of course, there's Chaitanya's lunchtime talk, which will be available in video form sometime tomorrow. Tomorrow, there's going to be an interesting talk by some of our designer friends about design principles for Windows 7. As well as on Thursday, there's going to be an MFC talk that is about just developing applications for Windows, but Damien is going to be covering some new up-and-coming features in MFC. We have a white paper on your hard drive that you're going to be getting that talks about these new APIs and functionality. We're updating our Windows UX guidelines as well to reflect how we recommend that you take advantage of these new integration points. We're doing a series of videos for Channel 9 and Channel 10, so stay tuned to and be on the lookout for those. And then finally, of course, there's the E7 blog, which is covering just the general Windows 7 engineering process. And so we'll have some desktop integration-related articles on there. Before I open it up for Q&A, just an obvious question, when will I get these bits? As I mentioned, this new UI is not available in the M3 build, unfortunately. It is a real bummer, but it's just... but we just wanted to at least be able to show you guys this stuff as soon as we could and get you thinking about the new desktop integration points. Early in 2009, as Stephen said this morning, you can expect to get the beta. And in there, we will have all of this code available for you to use and start working with. After the Q&A right now, feel free to tag me in the Tech Lounge. I'll be there as often as I can. Happy to geek out about anything taskbar related that you want or about this new desktop integration stuff. Or just go ahead and email me at Microsoft, directly at Microsoft. Just my name, rob.jarrett@microsoft.com. I would like to encourage you to please fill out the session evaluation form, as well as the recording of this talk will be available very shortly. And with that, I'd like to open it up for any question and answer. Would you mind using the mic if I could?
I have a question, okay?
If I could, okay, we'll start over here on the left.
Thank you. I'd like to release application image, same application image for Windows XP and Vista and Windows 7. So do the application with jump list and application ID and thumbnail toolbar have a bad influence on Windows XP?
So you're asking about down-level compatibility, essentially, for these new APIs? As with any new operating system feature, we recommend that you, if you need to run down-level, that you should write your code in such a way that it doesn't require it to be run on Windows 7, but that you should just gracefully degrade your application's capabilities in that instance. So if the typical approach is to detect what version of Windows you're running on. If you are running on a certain version of Windows that you know supports those APIs, go ahead and call them. But if not, don't call those APIs. So we will not provide, though, in Vista or XP, any support for the application ID jump list stuff explicitly.
Thank you.
We'll go over to this side now.
Are there any localization consideration for all of this stuff? There's a fair number of strings, like user, like names of the tasks and stuff.
Yep.
What if, like, we have MUI packs on Windows 7 and user switches the language? How the configured task list change, or is there any way of doing this?
Absolutely. So as far as the strings that I was hard coding for example, user tasks, they're all specifiable as resource IDs. So if you use the the @ sign and then use a DLL name and then a resource ID, we'll actually load the string out of that DLL and present it in the UI. So you actually don't have to hard code it. I hard coded it just for demo purposes. Does that answer your question? Okay. Just going over here now.
I was going to ask if the desktop integration file that you showed, that very thin wrapper, was going to be available. I don't know how useful that would be, though, given that you said that the build that we have doesn't have the new features. But will that be
I'm
available?
happy to make it available. In fact, I can basically make it available once beta comes out. It probably wouldn't be much use earlier than that. I guess maybe if people do want it, I could share it. There's no reason to not. So yeah, I can absolutely make it available, the samples. And so I would say perhaps watch the Channel 9 page of this talk, and then I'll just put the code up there.
Okay. Was that automatically generated, or was that something that was built up by the team?
I hand-coded it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, there are certain applications that deliberately allow only one instance of execution.
Yes.
In your jump list, I saw that there's a system menu that allows you to launch another instance. Is there any way to suppress that?
That's a great question. Currently, we do not allow the explicit suppression of launching another instance of your application. I don't know if I have some colleagues at the back of the room here. Any of you guys have anything that you'd want to really add there in terms of that? Just run up to a microphone, or actually I can... here. Yeah, this one works. Don't speak directly to it.
Okay. So the question is about
suppressing the
relaunch.
instances.
Essentially, it's up to your application to handle the single instance scenario. So you already handle that by detecting that you've got a process already running and that you need to communicate with it in some way, or to just basically shut down your extra process and bring that other process up to the foreground. That's usually the typical pattern. So you already have communication over to that other process. And so our recommendation in that case, the tasks here are basically a V1. We're certainly looking to improve in future versions of Windows, but for Win 7, we are going to launch a new instance of your process. And so it becomes the app developer's responsibility to marshal that over, RPC it, and then do whatever the task tells you to do in that case. But that's the appropriate way to handle it, at least in this version of Windows.
Okay. I have one more question, which is, let's say that I have the same process which gets customized for different applications. And as a consequence, the main window icon, particularly in this WPF style programming, it changes for different applications. When you guys group those applications on the taskbar, is there any way to specify that this common group icon be shown instead of each individual applications icon? This is a problem in Vista 2 today, by the way. This is not a Win 7 thing. What happens is that if main windows for the same process, different instances have different icons.
Right.
It shows some arbitrary icon in the group.
Right. And what we do today is we did refine that a little bit so that we don't just query the executable for its default icon, but we also look at the icon that is in the launching shortcut, as well as, do you know if the actual overriding of the property?
Yeah, so in this short demo today, we didn't have time to cover all of the new APIs that we provided. There's a variety of different ways to express that app ID that Rob talked about, and one of those ways is to actually place it onto each individual window if necessary. So even in the same process, you could have multiple windows that appear in separate groups on the taskbar, have separate jump lists, and so if you have like a host process, we have this problem with Run DLL32, where we've got a lot of CPLs that run in the control panels that run in there. And so there are methods to do that, and I recommend looking at both the white paper and at the upcoming documentation when the beta comes out. We'll have documentation on all of those APIs and how to integrate that, so you will be able to separate that out.
Another question?
Yeah, have you had any thoughts of allowing the taskbar to extend to secondary monitors attached to the machine? See?
Multimon.
Yes.
Yes. Well, that's the first time we ever heard about that. So thoughts in terms of would it be a good idea or just...
Have you thought about implementing it?
Yeah, absolutely we have thought about implementing it. We've thought a lot about implementing it.
Are you going to?
However, it is not as straightforward as you may think. There are a number of issues that arise if you start working through the different models for how it should be multimon. So first of all, the question to ask is a lot of users that when they request it is, why do you want a multimon taskbar? Is it so that you get more room, or is it so that you can locally switch between windows on different monitors? And if it's so you get more room, well, we've certainly added, with the new cleaner model, a lot more room on the taskbar by default. If it's so that you can switch between windows on different monitors, well, then you get into what exactly does the taskbar show on different monitors. You get into the situation where a user may have to kind of search through their monitors in order to find a particular window, or if they drag a window between monitors, that icons are disappearing and reappearing, or do you show another start menu that's on that other taskbar, or another set of notification icons, or a clock, and so forth. And so then it kind of gets into this weird mix, I guess, of exactly what the true identity of these different taskbars are going to be. I'm not saying that it's not an impossible problem to be solved. I'm not saying it's nothing that, we think it's a very important thing to solve. For Windows 7, however, we ultimately decided to prioritize, the goals that we've focused on, that Chaitanya did a great job of covering in his lunchtime talk in terms of making things, keeping things at the user's fingertips, making them be able to switch with confidence. Basically just taking the existing taskbar and really amping it up and making that a great experience. And hopefully in Windows 8, we can actually get around to doing a proper implementation of a multi-mon taskbar. But for now, in Windows 7, unfortunately, we will likely not have multi-mon support. I don't know, Chaitanya, if you have anything to add at all, or... Okay, thank you. Okay, should I wrap it up, by the way, AV guys, or one more question? Okay, so we'll take another question over here, and I'm happy to talk to you guys offline. So yes, sir.
It was mentioned that in Windows 7 it's going to be .NET 3.5 SP1, not .NET 4 that ships.
Right.
So we're not going to get the .NET 4 integration for these features in WPF out of the box. So we have to use a wrapper for the first version of Windows 7 because .NET 4 won't be available.
Well, the wrapper will be available, or rather, I'm sorry, the WPF support for our taskbar APIs will be in .NET 4, and so presumably there'll be a .NET 4 runtime, as there has been for previous new versions of .NET. So, if your installer would install.
Well, the key is .NET 4 even going to be available at the time of Windows 7 launch?
Okay. So the answer would be, I believe, no.
Okay.
I'm not.
That's
I'm
what
not privy to .NET 4 release plans.
The answer is we're doing predictive scheduling here, and we can't guess much.
Okay, so
you're saying we can't really guess. Yeah, so
I as an app dev have to use the wrappers. I cannot count on the XAML to be there when Windows 7 launches for these features.
Hello? Okay. As for the XAML specifically, no. However, there is an initiative that we're currently working on called Windows Bridge, and if you're familiar with the Vista Bridge, it's basically a whole set of WPF wrappers and all that kind of stuff that comes out in the SDK. And so we are working on that, and these features are certainly and the top set of the ones that we're looking at putting into that and making available via the SDK. So while not via XAML immediately at launch, as far as we know. We don't know the schedule for that at this time.
Okay.
But we're definitely working on making it available to .NET developers very easily.
Yeah. Generally, I think I can probably speak for a lot of people in the room. I'm trying to avoid writing it twice.
Yeah,
so,
that's a great point. I think what you can expect, like Ben said, for RTM is the Windows 7 platform support, so the Windows 7 bridge level wrapping of these APIs. It'll be better than what I did here for demo purposes, more elegant, a little easier to use, and so forth. The XAML support, will have to be in .NET 4, as far as I understand it. I've tried to press the WPF folks for an exact, like if they're going to release it any sooner or not, and they just said, say .NET 4, and we'll leave it at that.
Okay.
So,
and just one other comment, just probably a comment, not a question. Is Microsoft really backing themselves into a massive design corner by introducing these features? By having this level of support, by having the menus there, by introducing progress bars, how are you freeing up the taskbar for future visualization while not locking it into a set specific implementation for the future?
wow, that's a great question.
Because it really feels like a lock. If it's there, it stays there forever, as the APIs you showed us demonstrate. Sure. That stuff is 1994 up there. And I'm really worried that it looks like a great feature, but there's going to be the next cool thing and the next cool thing and the next cool thing, and are we going to get super sprouty bars? I mean, what's going to occur?
Well, certainly we'll continue innovating on the user interface. And for Windows 8, if we do come up with any further, evolutionary paradigms for things, even if we came up with something completely radically brand new, it's our, we try as hard as we can to certainly support stuff in a backwards way. I mean, I couldn't really say anything beyond that. Absolutely, we'll try and make it work. Your comment, though, about us designing into a corner, we certainly do think these things through at the time, and we certainly don't anticipate it on being any kind of an issue at all. So, I don't know. But that's a great comment to make, and I appreciate you. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to answer more questions offline, and enjoy the rest of the PDC.